Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Before we begin, take a breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If you believe some stories are meant to be felt more than told, then you're in the right place. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My mother's passing had taught me the first half of that cruel lesson years ago, in a quiet, grieving house. Now, standing beneath the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of a sterile hospital room, my father, Arthur Sterling, was teaching me the rest. The synthetic hum of the life support machinery felt like a heavy metronome, counting down the final seconds of my autonomy. Underneath the overpowering, throat-burning stench of clinical bleach and rubbing alcohol, there was the faint, tragic trace of his old cologne, sandalwood and aging paper, fading into the cold air just as he was. For years, my hands had known only the delicate, quiet work of salvation. I spent my days in a drafty, lavender-scented attic studio in the city, bent over magnifying lamps. Coaxing life back into frayed silk threads, I restored antique lace, meticulously mending the fragile, forgotten histories of other families, while my own unraveled at terrifying speed. Arthur had been a brilliant historian, a man entirely consumed by the preservation of the past, but he was a catastrophic failure at surviving the present. He had borrowed against our home, against my future, against names he had no right to invoke, all to fund his obsessive acquisitions. Now, his legacy was not a museum wing, but a mountain of aggressive, ruinous debt that was poised to crush me the moment his heart stopped beating. I stood by the metal bedrail, my calloused fingers tracing the cold steel, waiting for an apology that would never come. Arthur did not possess the breath for regret. His pale eyes were fixed firmly on the heavy wooden door of the private ward, watching it with the desperate, feverish intensity of a trapped animal calculating its final escape. When the door finally opened, the air pressure in the room seemed to drop, the clinical hospital atmosphere instantly displaced by the sharp, imposing scent of cedarwood and freezing rain. Julian Vance stepped inside. He did not enter a room, so much as he eclipsed it, dressed in a heavy dark wool coat that was still damp from the Pacific Northwest storm raging outside. He was a man carved from the dark, unforgiving stone of the coastline. He carried an impenetrable, terrifying stillness. There was no pity in his dark eyes, no soft bedside manner. He stood at the foot of the bed, an immovable monolith, waiting for a dead man to speak. Arthur's chest rattled, a terrifying, wet sound that made my stomach twist, but he did not look at me. He looked only at the billionaire towering over him. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, violently, transforming from a place of mourning into a high-stakes corporate boardroom. With a sudden, shocking burst of adrenaline, my father reached out. His skeletal, pale fingers clamped down around Julian's thick wrist. The visual contrast was jarring, the frail, trembling desperation of a bankrupt historian locking onto the dark, expensive fabric of an empire's heir. "You owe me," Arthur wheezed, his voice reduced to a harsh, scraping whisper. He did not beg, he demanded. Julian did not pull away. He simply stared down at the dying man, his jaw ticking, his expression locked in absolute restraint. With his free hand, my father fumbled blindly beneath his thin cotton pillow, retrieving a heavy object that glinted under the awful fluorescent lighting. It was his silver pocket watch, an antique heirloom he had refused to liquidate, even when the bank threatened foreclosure. The metal casing clicked open, the loud, rhythmic ticking suddenly joining the hiss of the ventilator. Arthur pressed the cold metal directly into Julian's palm, forcing the younger man's large fingers to close over it. "Take the debt," my father gasped, his grip on Julian's wrist tightening until his own knuckles turned entirely translucent. "Marry her. Keep the wolves away from her door. Swear it on the watch, Julian. You owe this to me." A sickening wave of humiliation crashed over my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. I was not a daughter being given away in love. I was an asset being forcefully transferred, a desperate liability being thrust onto the ledger of Vance Enterprises to balance an old, unspoken score. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but sharp. "Dad, stop. Don't do this. I don't want." "Swear it," Arthur hissed, ignoring me entirely, his fading eyes locked in a ferocious battle of wills with the stoic giant beside him. Julian still refused to meet my eyes. He kept his gaze pinned to my father, absorbing the desperate violence of the demand, without a single flinch. The silence in the room grew so thick it felt like water filling my lungs. I watched the slight shift in Julian's broad shoulders, the infinitesimal tightening of his grip around the silver pocket watch. He did not sigh. He did not offer a comforting platitude. He simply gave a single rigid nod. I swear it. Julian's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate against the cold linoleum floor. Arthur exhaled, a long, shuddering release of breath. The frantic, iron-tight grip on the billionaire's wrist went entirely slack. Less than a minute later, the heart monitor flatlined, a continuous, shrill tone that shattered the quiet. I stood paralyzed by the bed, my hands pressed over my mouth, drowning in the bitter realization that my father's final act of love was a hostile, terrifying takeover of my future. Julian quietly took a step back into the shadows of the room, slipping the watch into his coat pocket. He gave me space, standing silent in the corner, a dark, silent jailer who had just purchased the rest of my life. Morning came quietly. No trumpets, no shift in the universe. Just a pale beam of light slipping through the tall windows, brushing against my shoulder like a second thought. It had been barely a week since the hospital, yet the world had already reorganized itself into a cold, clinical reality. I had spent the past 7 days moving through a thick, suffocating fog, packing up the fragmented remains of my father's life. The house that had once smelled of roasted coffee and old parchment now reeked of cardboard boxes and the sharp, chemical scent of industrial cleaners used by the bank's foreclosure agents. Every knock on the door was another creditor, another threat, another piece of mail stamped in urgent red ink. Julian Vance had not visited the house. He did not call to offer empty condolences. Instead, a silent army of lawyers and accountants in dark suits had descended, systematically erasing the sterling debt with terrifying efficiency. My father's ruinous ledgers were balanced, paid in full by a man I had only met in a sterile hospital ward. The price for my salvation was absolute surrender, and my collection date was set for a Thursday morning in the pouring rain. I stood in the center of my drafty, lavender-scented attic studio for what I thought would be the final time, listening to the rain beat against the small skylight. The slanted wooden floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked over to my heavy oak work desk. I ran my fingers over the familiar tools, the magnifying lamps, the spools of silk, the delicate needles that had always been my anchor. For years, this room had been my only sanctuary against the chaos of my father's failing finances. Now, it felt like a museum of a life I was no longer permitted to lead. I turned off the small desk lamp, the click echoing loudly in the stillness, and locked the door behind me, stepping out into a brutal, relentless autumn downpour, the kind that stripped the color from the city, and left only sharp edges behind. The rain was beating relentlessly against the towering, foggy marble pillars of the county courthouse. I stood in the echoing hallway, wearing a simple, dark charcoal dress that felt more like mourning attire than bridal wear. There was no white silk pooling around me. There was no joy, no nervous anticipation. There was only the phantom weight of the mended lace veil I had carefully packed in my trunk, the only precious piece of my past I couldn't bear to leave behind. I had spent 6 months restoring that historical piece, weaving together broken threads with invisible stitches. I had imagined wearing it one day, for a man who looked at me with warmth. Instead, I had left it behind, fully aware that a transactional bride had no right to wear a symbol of enduring love. Julian stood a few feet away, staring out the rain-slicked window. He wore a severe, immaculate dark suit that functioned as architectural armor, keeping the world, and me, at an absolute distance. We had not spoken more than 10 words since the hospital. He did not ask how I was grieving. He simply handled the funeral expenses, the immediate creditors, and the legal filings with devastating, silent efficiency. The silence stretching between us in that echoing marble corridor was not the comfortable, easy quiet of old friends. It was a heavy, pressurized void, thick with unspoken boundaries and rigid expectations. Every time he shifted his weight, the faint, imposing scent of cedarwood and cold rain drifted toward me, a sharp contrast to the stale, dusty smell of the courthouse. I watched the tense line of his broad shoulders, the way his jaw clamped tight as he stared out at the gray, unforgiving city skyline. He looked less like a groom waiting for a ceremony, and more like a soldier steeling himself for a deployment he had never requested. I tightened my grip on my small leather purse, refusing to let him see the slight tremor in my hands. I would not burden him with my tears, and I certainly would not ask for a tenderness he was incapable of giving. We were two strangers trapped in my father's final gamble, bound together by a silver pocket watch and a mountain of guilt. Footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor, signaling the arrival of Richard Vance. Julian's uncle and the chief trustee of the family empire moved with a predatory, calculating grace. He carried a leather folio that smelled of expensive polish and ruthless corporate litigation. Richard did not regard me as a new member of the family. His cold, assessing eyes swept over my plain dress, categorizing me as an unfortunate audit, a temporary anomaly on his pristine balance sheets. When the magistrate called us into the small, windowless civil chamber, the ceremony was dispatched with the clinical speed of a bank transaction. There was no music. There were no flowers to soften the stark wooden benches. When it was time to speak, mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. Julian's voice was equally flat, a dark, even monotone that echoed against the plaster walls, fulfilling his oath to a dead man without an ounce of inflection. We moved to a heavy mahogany table in the corner to sign the paperwork. Richard unclasped his leather folio, sliding the pre-negotiated contract document across the polished wood. It was printed on thick, cream-colored parchment, a beautiful, heavy canvas for a brutal transaction. I picked up the heavy brass fountain pen and read the terms. They were explicit and absolute. I was to be a permanent, quiet resident at the sprawling, remote Vance Manor. My father's massive debts would be quietly absorbed and neutralized. We would maintain separate living quarters. I would have no legal or financial claim to the Vance empire, and I was expected to remain invisible to the press. It was a gilded, heavily guarded cage. I pressed the pen to the paper, signing my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I refused to let Richard see my hand tremble. I held on to my quiet dignity, like a heavy shield, determined to survive this transaction with my spine straight. I pushed the document back across the table, expecting the ordeal to be over, but Richard did not close the folio. Instead, a thin, patronizing smile touched the corners of his mouth as he extracted one final single sheet of paper and slid it directly in front of me. An addendum, Richard stated, his voice dripping with condescension. A standard financial waiver. It simply states that you will immediately liquidate your little antique lace business and vacate that drafty studio in the city. The board feels it is highly inappropriate for a Vance wife to be engaged in manual, hourly labor. It invites the wrong sort of public scrutiny. My chest tightened, a sudden, sharp spike of panic, making it difficult to breathe. That studio was not just a business. It was my sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where I possessed absolute control, the only quiet corner where my skills were valued and my mind was at peace. To tear it down, to sell my magnifying lamps and my delicate threads, was to erase the last remaining piece of my identity. I parted my dry lips, preparing to fight, to reject the addendum even if it meant risking the entire arrangement and facing the creditors alone. Before a single sound could leave my throat, a shadow fell over the mahogany table. A large, heavy hand descended from my left. Julian's wide palm flattened directly over the financial waiver, trapping the paper against the wood. He did not slam his hand down. He did not move with frantic anger. He moved with the terrifying, unhurried certainty of an avalanche. Slowly, deliberately, Julian slid the paper backward, dragging it away from my side of the table and pushing it directly back toward his uncle. No, Julian said. It was a single word, spoken in a low rumble, but it carried the weight of iron. Richard's patronizing smile vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, defensive flush. Julian, be reasonable. The board will not tolerate. I said no, Richard. Julian cut him off. His tone was entirely devoid of heat, yet absolute in its authority. He didn't raise his voice by a single decibel. He simply asserted a boundary made of steel. He turned slightly, shifting his broad shoulders to physically block Richard's line of sight to me. Her studio remains untouched. The terms of the original contract stand as written. Do not put another piece of paper in front of my wife. My breath hitched at the word, wife. It sounded strange, heavy, and suddenly dangerous coming from him. Richard stared at his nephew for a long, vibrating moment, silently calculating the cost of a war he knew he could not win. Finally, his jaw tight with restrained fury, the older man snatched the addendum off the table, shoved it into his folio, and turned on his heel, marching out of the chamber without another word. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Julian and me alone in the oppressive quiet of the courthouse room. I looked up at him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wanted to thank him, to ask him why he had defended a business he had never even seen. But Julian did not look down at me. He did not seek my gratitude, nor did he offer a warm, comforting smile to ease my shock. He simply picked up his damp wool coat from the back of the chair and turned toward the exit, his posture as remote and inaccessible as ever. "The car is waiting," he murmured, his voice returning to its flat, emotionless baseline. I followed his broad back out into the cold, driving rain. As we descended the marble steps in total silence, the chill of the storm biting through my thin dress, I realized the terrifying truth of my new reality. I had signed my life away to a man made of cold granite, stepping willingly into a cold, isolating cage. But as I watched Julian silently open the heavy car door for me, the rain soaking his shoulders, I understood something else. My jailer was also standing guard at the door, facing outward. I slid onto the cold, stiff leather of the passenger seat, pulling my damp charcoal coat tighter around my shoulders. Julian closed the heavy door with a solid, isolating thud, shutting out the roar of the autumn storm and the chaotic noise of the city. A moment later, he slid into the driver's seat, bringing the sharp chill of the rain and that grounding scent of cedarwood into the confined space of the luxury car. He didn't start the engine immediately. For a long, suspended minute, he simply rested his large, wet hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead through the water, streaming down the windshield. The silence in the car was absolute. I stared at his profile, tracing the harsh, uncompromising lines of his jaw. He kept his eyes fixed forward. He did not ask if I was warm, or if the ruthless demands of his uncle had shaken my resolve. He just reached out, turning the heating dial up a few notches so that a wave of warm air washed over my freezing hands. It was a tiny, wordless gesture, not an apology, not a declaration, just a practical, silent act of care. The engine roared to life, a deep, vibrating hum beneath us, and the car pulled away from the curb. As we drove out of the city, leaving my old life behind, the towering iron gates of Vance Manor loomed in the foggy distance. The transaction was complete, but as the dark trees swallowed the narrow road leading to my new home, I felt the strange, terrifying sensation that a completely different kind of story had just begun. The iron gates of Vance Manor did not welcome us. They simply swallowed us whole. As the heavy luxury car crawled up the winding, gravel driveway, the vast estate emerged from the thick Pacific Northwest fog like a forgotten fortress. It was a staggering structure of dark, weathered stone and endless rows of towering glass windows that reflected the relentless gray downpour. There was no warm porch light waiting to guide us in. There was only the freezing rain, the distant, violent roar of the ocean, crashing against the cliffs, and the overwhelming sensation that I had just been locked inside a very expensive, very beautiful tomb. Julian brought the vehicle to a halt near the grand entrance. He did not turn to me. He did not offer a word of comfort or a tour of my new prison. He simply stepped out into the storm, buttoned his damp wool coat, and handed his keys to an attendant who had materialized from the shadows. By the time I managed to open my own door and step onto the wet cobblestones, Julian was already walking up the sweeping stone steps. His broad shoulders were tense, his mind clearly miles away in some sterile corporate boardroom. He disappeared into the cavernous house without looking back. I stood shivering in the driveway, clutching my small leather purse against my charcoal dress, feeling entirely unmoored. "Mrs. Vance." The voice was quiet, completely devoid of inflection, yet it carried clearly through the sound of the rain. I turned to find a woman standing just inside the massive oak double doors. Martha Gable, the estate's housekeeper, was a tall, spare woman with iron gray hair pulled back into a severe knot. She wore a pristine, starched uniform that looked as unyielding as the architecture around us. Her dark eyes swept over my shivering frame, but she did not offer a sympathetic smile. She did not coddle me or rush forward with a warm blanket. She possessed the observant, guarded stillness of someone who understood that showing too much emotion in this house was a dangerous liability. "I am Martha," she said simply, stepping aside to let me enter. "I will show you to your quarters. Mr. Vance has instructed that you are not to be disturbed unless you request it." I crossed the threshold, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind me, instantly silencing the storm outside. The interior of Vance Manor was breathtakingly cold. The floors were vast expanses of polished black marble that mirrored the dim, atmospheric lighting of the crystal chandeliers hanging far above. The walls were lined with dark, imposing portraits of Vance's ancestors who seemed to look down at me with calculating disdain. There was no clutter, no stray books, no signs of actual human life. It was a museum of wealth, completely devoid of warmth. I followed Martha up the grand, sweeping staircase, our footsteps echoing loudly in the suffocating silence. She led me down a long, dimly lit corridor in the east wing, finally stopping before a heavy wooden door. When she pushed it open, I stepped into a suite that was larger than my entire childhood home. It was decorated in muted tones of slate and silver, featuring a massive four-poster bed, a sitting area with velvet armchairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the raging sea. It was flawless. It was completely lifeless. "Your luggage has already been unpacked," Martha murmured, standing perfectly still in the doorway. "Dinner is served at 8. If you prefer to take your meals here, you have only to ring." "Thank you, Martha," I said, my voice sounding incredibly small in the vast room. I hesitated, wrapping my arms around my waist. Where are Julian's rooms?" Martha's expression was a rigid mask of neutrality. She simply gestured her chin back toward the endless hallway. "Mr. Vance resides entirely in the West Wing. He rarely crosses to this side of the estate. You will find that you have a great deal of privacy here, ma'am." With a slight rigid bow of her head, she closed the door, leaving me alone in the crushing quiet. For 2 long months, that silence became my entire world. Julian and I existed as ghosts in the same massive house, our paths carefully orchestrated by the invisible hands of the estate staff to ensure we never accidentally crossed. I took my meals alone in a formal dining room that could seat 30 people. The clinking of my silver fork against the porcelain echoed like gunshots in the vast empty space. I spent my afternoons wandering the endless, cold galleries, running my fingers over the edges of antique sideboards, desperate for something to do, something to fix. But nothing in Vance Manor was broken. Everything was maintained with terrifying perfection. To survive the isolation, I retreated into the only piece of my old life I had been allowed to bring. I transformed the small sitting area of my bedroom into a makeshift studio, laying out my needles, my magnifying glass, and my spools of silk thread. Spread across a velvet armchair was the restored heirloom. It was an antique Belgian piece, incredibly fragile, something I had been painstakingly restoring in my drafty Boston attic before my father's gambling debts had swallowed our lives whole. Every day, I sat by the window and stitched. I anchored myself in the tactile reality of the threads, pulling them tight, binding the torn edges together. The delicate, floral scent of lavender from my old workspace lingered faintly on the fabric, a stubborn ghost, refusing to be exorcised by the pristine, cold air of the manor. That fragile piece of history became my quiet rebellion. It was proof that broken things could be held together, with enough patience, even when the world around them felt entirely unyielding. Occasionally, the silence of the house would break in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. I would find a fresh log burning in the fireplace when I returned from a walk, or a rare book on European textiles, left anonymously on my reading table. I would catch the sharp, grounding aroma of cedarwood lingering in the empty hallways, a phantom trace of my husband passing through. But Julian remained a shadow, a stoic guardian who kept his distance, honoring the cold transaction of our marriage by ensuring I never had to look at my buyer. By the end of the second month, the isolation began to feel like a physical weight, pressing against my ribs. The autumn rains had been relentless, trapping me indoors. Unable to sleep one evening, I wrapped a thick woolen shawl over my shoulders and left my suite. Wandering aimlessly through the darkened corridors of the estate, the house was asleep, Only a few low-wattage sconces threw long, distorted shadows against the shadowed walls. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, the air grew noticeably colder. I realized I had crossed the invisible boundary into the west wing. I stopped in front of a pair of heavy, dark mahogany doors that stood slightly ajar. A faint, golden light spilled out into the hallway, carrying with it a scent that immediately made my chest tighten. It was the sharp, rich aroma of cedarwood mixed with the faint, dusty smell of old paper. Julian's private study. I stood frozen in the hallway, knowing I had no right to cross that threshold. The contract was explicit about our boundaries. Yet, the open door felt like a strange, magnetic pull. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. Before I could take a step backward, a floorboard creaked softly behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, expecting to see Julian's towering, furious frame. Instead, Martha stood in the shadows, holding a small silver tray. She looked at me, then looked past me to the slightly open doors of the study. She did not reprimand me. She did not tell me I was trespassing. Moving with her usual silent grace, Martha stepped forward and bypassed me entirely. She walked into the study, set the silver tray down on a low side table near the door, and walked back out. As she passed me in the hallway, she didn't meet my eyes. She simply folded her hands in front of her crisp apron and disappeared back down the corridor, leaving me alone. I let out a shaky breath and stepped cautiously into the room. The study was a stark contrast to the rest of the austere manor. It was lined with towering, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, legal texts, and architectural blueprints. A massive oak desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with files and an old brass lamp that cast a warm, localized pool of light. But it was the silver tray Martha had left behind that caught my attention. Sitting on the polished metal surface was a steaming cup of chamomile tea. Beside the delicate porcelain saucer lay a single, heavy brass key. I stared at the key, my pulse beating a frantic rhythm against my throat. Martha hadn't just brought me tea. She had given me permission. She had seen my silent, desperate confusion over the past 2 months and had chosen to hand me an answer. I picked up the cold brass key, the metal heavy and archaic against my palm. I moved slowly toward Julian's massive desk, my eyes scanning the locked drawers. There was only one that required a key of this size, the deep bottom drawer on the right side. I knelt on the thick Persian rug, my hands trembling slightly as I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I pulled the heavy wooden drawer open. It was not filled with corporate secrets or offshore bank accounts. Resting at the very bottom was a dust-covered wooden box. It looked incredibly old, the wood scratched and dented, entirely out of place in a room where everything else was calculated and pristine. I lifted the box out, the layer of fine dust coating my fingertips, and set it carefully on the edge of the desk. There was no lock on it. I undid the small metal clasp and pushed the hinged lid open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded green felt, was a dark brown, worn notebook. It was my father's leather-bound journal. I carefully lifted it out, my fingers tracing the scuffed edges. The leather smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old archives. I opened the stiff cover, and the breath left my lungs in a sudden, violent rush. There, heavily pressed into the brittle paper with a fountain pen, was a chaotic, slanted scrawl. It was Arthur's handwriting, my father's. My vision blurred as I turned to the first drafted entry. The scent of aging paper and dried ink wafted up, a ghost of the man I had just buried. Julian, the first drafted correspondence began. I received the files from your uncle's legal team. Richard is a shark, but he lacks the patience for history. Do not let him convince the board that your grief makes you unfit to lead. I have located the original founding charters in the city archives. The trust explicitly requires a unanimous vote to remove an heir on medical grounds, a vote Richard does not have. Keep your head down. Let them think the silence has broken you. I will build the fortress around your assets from here. You saved my academic career when no one else would touch a bankrupt historian. I will not let them take your legacy. A. Sterling. I read the entry again, and then a third time, the words blurring together as the terrifying, absolute truth finally clicked into place. I set the journal down on the desk and frantically turned the next page, then the next. The entries spanned years. They detailed a quiet, fierce alliance between a disgraced, obsessive historian and a young, grieving billionaire who was being hunted by his own family. When Julian's parents had died, Richard Vance had tried to use Julian's subsequent withdrawal and silence to declare him medically incompetent, plotting to seize total control of the Vance empire. My father, with his obsessive knowledge of archaic trust laws and historical charters, had spent years quietly finding the legal loopholes that kept Julian safe. Arthur had been Julian's shield, when the billionaire had been too paralyzed by trauma to fight for himself. My hands shook so violently that the pages of the journal rattled against the oak desk. I looked at the dust-covered wooden box, my understanding of my own life, shattering and rearranging itself, in the span of a single heartbeat. Julian had not married me out of pity. He had not simply purchased a desperate girl to balance a ledger. He had stood in that sterile hospital room, looking down at the frail man who had once saved his life, and he had accepted a debt of absolute honor. My father had traded his silence, his years of hidden labor, for the ultimate protection of his daughter. Julian was not my jailer. He was a vault, silently bearing the weight of a promise he could never explain. I carefully closed my father's leather-bound journal. I didn't put it back in the dust-covered box. Instead, I held it against my chest, my heart aching with a strange, heavy mixture of grief and profound respect. I locked the drawer, leaving the brass key exactly where Martha had placed it on the silver tray, and picked up the cup of chamomile tea. It was still warm. I took a slow sip, the floral heat grounding me in the present. I had walked into this study as a commodified asset, entirely resentful of the man who owned my debt. I walked out knowing that the cold, impenetrable walls of Vance Manor were actually built to keep me safe. After that night in the study, the invisible walls between Julian and me began to subtly shift. Neither of us spoke of my intrusion, but the silence in the manor no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a shared breath. 2 more months passed, pushing us deep into the 4th month of our arrangement. The coastal autumn finally surrendered to a harsh, unforgiving winter. The sky above the estate turned the color of bruised iron, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began to crawl up the edges of the towering glass panes in my bedroom. It started as a low, mournful howl, winding its way through the pine trees on the cliffs. Within hours, the severe winter storm had escalated into a blinding blizzard, trapping us entirely inside the stone walls of the estate. I sat by the window in my suite, wrapped in multiple layers of wool, watching the snow violently erase the landscape. The heating system in the old manor groaned against the plummeting temperatures, struggling to push warmth through the cavernous vents. Despite my heavy shawl, a bone-deep chill had begun to settle into my chest, making my hands tremble uncontrollably as I tried to guide my needle through the delicate threads of the bridal lace. I coughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to echo too loudly in the quiet room. A soft knock broke my concentration. Before I could answer, the door pushed open just a fraction. Martha did not enter, but a moment later, the sharp, familiar scent of cedarwood drifted into the room. I set the lace aside and stood on shaky legs, walking toward the small table near the door. Resting on it was the silver tea kettle, a faint wisp of steam rising from its curved spout. Beside it lay a small ceramic cup and a fresh blend of chamomile and ginger. Julian had not shown his face, but he had felt the temperature drop. He had known the storm would chill the East Wing, and he had sent the one thing he knew would bring me warmth. I poured a cup, my shivering hands clutching the hot ceramic. I walked back to my armchair and picked up my father's leather-bound journal, which I had kept hidden beneath my pillows since that night in the study. As the blizzard raged outside, beating furiously against the cold glass, I pressed the worn leather to my chest. I felt a strange, terrifying heat flush through my face, the first warning sign of a fever I could not ignore. Yet, looking at the silver tea kettle gleaming in the dim light, the bitter resentment that had frozen my heart for months, finally quietly began to thaw. The heat of the ceramic cup faded against the overwhelming, terrifying fire building in my own blood. I remember trying to stand, tending to carry the silver tea kettle back to the hallway, to signal I was finished. But my knees abruptly buckled beneath me. The thick Persian rug rushed up to meet my face. The last thing I heard before the delirium truly dragged me under was the heavy, frantic thud of footsteps. Not the measured, silent glide of the housekeeper, but the urgent, chaotic tread of a man who had suddenly forgotten his own rigid rules of distance. Time lost its architecture. The next few days dissolved into a suffocating, blurred sequence of extreme temperatures and heavy shadows. The severe winter storm outside my bedroom windows became a continuous, roaring white noise that matched the violent ringing in my ears. I was trapped in a terrifying cycle of shivering uncontrollably beneath a mountain of heavy down comforters, only to wake up gasping, burning from the inside out, desperate to throw the blankets away. But every time I moved to cast off the covers, a large, impossibly heavy hand would gently press my shoulder back into the mattress. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my reality anchored only by sudden, acute sensory details. The sharp, grounding scent of cedarwood leaning close over my face. The shocking, merciful chill of a damp cloth being pressed firmly against my burning forehead. The quiet clinking of fresh ice being dropped into a crystal water pitcher. I had spent my entire adult life being the sole caretaker in my family, the one who navigated the terrifying medical emergencies and the crushing financial fallout of illness. Being cared for was an entirely alien sensation. It stripped away my defensive pride, leaving me exposed, unmoored, and completely reliant on the man who had purchased my future. On the second night of the blizzard, the fever reached its terrifying peak. I thrashed violently against the pillows, my lungs burning as I tried to draw breath, trapped in a hallucination where my father's creditors were tearing apart my drafty Boston attic. I cried out, a raw, broken sound that scraped against my dry throat, begging them to leave my magnifying lamps and my spools of silk thread alone. A sudden, startling weight grounded me. Strong arms wrapped entirely around my trembling shoulders, pulling my burning body upward until my face was pressed against the cool, crisp fabric of a dark dress shirt. "I'm here," a low, gravelly voice rumbled directly against my ear. The vibration of those two words traveled straight through my chest, cutting through the chaos of the delirium. I stopped thrashing. The scent of rain, cedarwood, and sheer, immovable strength surrounded me. I sagged against his broad chest, my shivering slowly subsiding as he held me with the terrifying, unyielding grip of a man who refused to let me slip away. "I heard you cry. I didn't like it," Julian murmured. The sound so quiet, it felt like a secret slipping through the dark. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell me everything would be fine. He simply held me in the dark, acting as a physical shield against the fever, until the frantic beating of my heart finally slowed to one to match the steady, calm rhythm of his own. When I drifted back toward awareness, the roaring wind against the glass panes had softened into a hollow, distant whistle. I lay perfectly still, my eyes closed, listening to a hushed, tense conversation drifting in from the slightly open door of the hallway. "You are missing the emergency shareholder vote, Julian." Richard Vance's voice crackled thinly through the speaker of a satellite phone, dripping with aggressive condescension. "The board is already questioning your competence to lead. If you do not dial into this merger conference in 5 minutes, I will be forced to file a motion of absence. We cannot afford to hemorrhage leverage, because you are suddenly playing nursemaid to a contractual obligation." There was a long, heavy pause. When Julian finally spoke, his tone was completely stripped of its usual deadpan diplomacy. It was a dark, unyielding steel that made the hair on my arm stand up. "Cancel the board call," my husband ordered softly. "Tell the shareholders whatever you want." "I do not care about the quarterly margins, Richard, and I do not care about your motions. Do not call this line again. I am not leaving this room." The phone beeped, severing the connection. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the pale, bruised light of the winter morning, slipping through the frost-covered windows. The fever had finally broken. My skin was cool, my breathing deep and unobstructed. I turned my head heavily against the pillow and found Julian. He had not returned to the West Wing. He had not retreated to his sterile corporate world. The billionaire was asleep, sitting completely upright in a hard, velvet armchair pulled directly flush against the edge of my mattress. He had discarded his suit jacket days ago. His white button-down shirt was wrinkled, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the corded, exhausted muscles of his forearms. My breath caught in my throat. His large, calloused hand was resting lightly over mine on top of the blankets. Beside us, resting in a small porcelain bowl on the nightstand, was the damp cloth, still radiating the faint warmth of his recent touch. He looked entirely worn down, the dark circles under his eyes, proving he had not slept since the blizzard began. I did not pull my hand away. For the first time since my father's death, I did not want to put my armor back on. I simply lay there in the quiet sanctuary he had built for me, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, profoundly humbled by the realization that this powerful stoic man had sacrificed his own empire just to make sure I could breathe. It took 4 more days for the snowplows to finally clear the winding gravel driveway of Vance Manor, reopening our isolated fortress to the outside world. I recovered quickly, my strength returning, as I resumed my quiet afternoons by the window, picking up my finest restoration project to finish the final delicate repairs. Julian had retreated back to his study, reinstating the physical distance between us, but the oppressive, heavy silence of the house had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a void. It was a space waiting to be filled, but the outside world did not wait long to intrude. On the 5th morning after the storm broke, I was sitting at my makeshift desk, sorting through my silk threads when I heard the distinct, heavy crunch of multiple tires on the gravel below. I looked out the towering glass window and saw a fleet of 4 black, armored SUVs idling near the grand entrance. Men in sharp, dark suits were spilling out of the vehicles, carrying heavy leather briefcases. At the center of the imposing group was Richard. A soft knock drew my attention away from the glass. Martha stepped into my suite, her iron gray hair pulled back even tighter than usual. Her face was a rigid mask of neutrality, but her dark eyes carried a sharp, urgent warning. Mr. Richard has called an emergency session of the regional board in the east drawing room, the housekeeper said quietly. He intends to use Mr. Vance's absence during the storm as grounds for a formal vote of no confidence. He is telling the directors that your marriage is a fabricated, unconsummated arrangement designed merely to bypass trust's stability clauses. He claims Mr. Vance is mentally unfit, hiding behind a fake wife. My stomach plummeted. Richard was using Julian's quiet devotion against him. Because my husband had chosen to stay by my feverish side, instead of defending his corporate margins, his uncle was moving to strip him of his entire family legacy. "Where is Julian?" I asked, my voice steadying as a cold, righteous anger began to replace my initial panic. "In the drawing room, ma'am," listening to them dismantle his authority without saying a word in his own defense. Martha folded her hands over her pristine apron. "He will not drag your name into a public spectacle to save himself. He intends to let them take it. Choices vanish quickly when you are cornered, but courage arrives just as fast when you realize what is worth protecting." I did not rush to my closet to find an expensive, glamorous dress to prove I belonged. I wore my simple, dark charcoal skirt and a high-necked wool sweater, the quiet, dignified armor of a working artisan. I walked over to my bedside table, reached beneath my pillows, and pulled out my father's leather-bound journal. The worn cover felt heavy and solid in my hands, a physical manifestation of a promise that was entirely real. I walked out of my suite, moving down the sweeping marble staircase with a steady, deliberate pace. I did not tiptoe. I let the sharp click of my low heels echo clearly through the cavernous hallways. When I reached the heavy oak double doors of the east drawing room, the aggressive, overlapping voices of corporate executives bled through the wood. Richard's voice rose above the rest, sharp and triumphant. "It is a phantom marriage," the older man declared loudly. "A desperate, pathetic transaction to appease the late patriarch's stipulations. There is no partnership here. My nephew is a recluse who purchased a bankrupt historian's daughter to serve as a legal placeholder. Are we truly going to leave the Vance empire in the hands of a man who hides from his own board behind a fake vow?" I did not knock. I simply pressed both hands against the brass handles and pushed the heavy doors wide open. The room fell instantly, violently silent. 12 board members, all dressed in immaculate bespoke suits, turned to stare at me. The air smelled of expensive espresso and predatory ambition, a suffocating atmosphere that sought to make me feel small. I ignored their hostile stares. I looked directly across the vast mahogany table to where Julian stood near the fireplace. He was leaning against the stone mantel, his expression an impenetrable mask of dark ice. But when I crossed the threshold, his broad shoulders stiffened, and a flash of raw, genuine shock broke through his stoic facade. He took a half step forward, his jaw clenching, clearly preparing to order me out of the room to spare me the humiliation. I shook my head slightly, catching his eye. "Let me do this," I communicated silently. "Let me be your shield today." I walked to the head of the polished table, ignoring Richard's fury-ascending glare. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a dramatic, theatrical shouting match. I relied entirely on the quiet academic dignity my father had taught me. I set the worn, dust-smudged journal down on the immaculate mahogany surface. The physical contrast of the battered artifact against the sterile corporate perfection was jarring. "My name is Cora Vance," I said, my voice completely level, echoing clearly in the stunned silence. "And you are entirely correct, Richard. My father was a bankrupt historian, but you seem to have forgotten exactly what history he was preserving." I flipped the heavy cover open, the scent of aging paper wafting into the cold room. I turned directly to the heavily inked pages I had memorized by the light of the brass lamp weeks ago. "This is an unredacted log of legal correspondence between Arthur Sterling and Julian Vance, spanning the last 6 years," I stated, looking up at the row of confused executives. "It details, with exact statutory citations, every illegal attempt Richard Vance has made to artificially devalue the trust's secondary assets to force a liquidation vote. It also contains the original founding charters my father located in the city archives. Charters which explicitly state that any trustee attempting to remove an heir on fabricated medical grounds immediately forfeits their own voting shares." Richard's face drained of color, his aggressive posture collapsing into sudden, rigid panic. That is unauthorized documentation, the rambling of a dead man in massive debt. It holds no legal weight. It holds the specific, documented proof of a conspiracy against the primary shareholder. I countered smoothly, sliding the open journal toward the center of the table so the other board members could see the dense, meticulous handwriting. "Julian did not marry me as a desperate transaction to save himself. He married me to honor an oath made to the man who spent 6 years quietly guarding this empire from its own internal rot. This marriage is not a placeholder. It is an unbreakable, honorable covenant forged between the two men who actually bled for this legacy." I stepped back from the table, my spine perfectly straight, refusing to shrink under the sudden, heavy stares of the room. "If you wish to vote on Julian's competence, you may do so. But understand that if you side with a trustee who has actively plotted against the charter, this journal will not just remain in this room. It will go to the federal regulators by nightfall." Silence descended on the drawing room, but it was no longer the oppressive, sterile quiet of Vance Manor. It was the breathless, stunned silence of a complete power shift. The board members looked from the weathered journal to Richard's pale, sweating face, the narrative of the fake, pathetic marriage completely dismantled. The older man opened his mouth to speak, to launch another defense. But one of the senior directors simply raised a hand, cutting him off entirely. The siege was over. The wolves had been pushed back from the door, not by an army of lawyers, but by the quiet dignity of a daughter honoring a debt and defending the man who had stayed by her bed in the dark. I did not wait for their formal apologies or their scrambling reassessments. I turned away from the mahogany table and walked back toward the heavy oak doors. Before I could reach the hallway, Julian moved. He bypassed his uncle, bypassed the stunned executives, and followed me out into the corridor, pulling the heavy oak doors shut behind us with a definitive, echoing click. We stood alone in the dim light of the east wing. The adrenaline that had carried me through the drawing room suddenly evaporated, leaving my hands trembling slightly. I clasped them together in front of my charcoal skirt, unsure of what I had just done. I had broken the rules of our contract. I had made myself visible. Julian stepped directly into my space. He did not look at me with the cold, calculating eyes of a billionaire assessing an asset. He looked at me with a terrifying, raw intensity, his dark eyes dropping to my trembling hands, and then back up to my face. The scent of cedarwood wrapped around me, overwhelming the lingering, sterile smell of the drawing room. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, his large, warm hand wrapped gently around my trembling fingers, capturing them just as he had done during the fever. He didn't speak a single word of gratitude. He didn't need to. The slight, almost imperceptible loosening of his broad shoulders and the profound quiet respect burning in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I listened to the muffled, heavy thud of the armored SUVs crunching over the gravel driveway outside, signaling Richard's retreat. The siege was broken. The cold, transactional cage we had both stepped into had finally shattered, leaving only a heavy, vibrating quiet, the kind of stillness that follows a massive, tectonic shift in the earth. Julian did not release my hand. Instead, his long fingers tightened slightly, applying a gentle grounding pressure that served as a silent command to follow him. He led me away from the east wing, turning his back entirely on the corporate battleground and the empire he had just defended. We walked in absolute silence, the sharp, rhythmic click of my low heels syncing perfectly with his heavy, measured strides. We bypassed his locked study, bypassed the grand marble staircase, and moved deeper into a forgotten, labyrinthine section of the estate I had never been permitted to explore. At the end of a long, narrow corridor, Julian pushed open a heavy glass-paneled door, and we stepped together into a sprawling, rain-slicked greenhouse. The temperature shift was sudden and overwhelming. The air inside the massive glass structure was thick, incredibly warm, and humid, carrying the rich, intoxicating scent of damp, potting soil, crushed velvet ferns, and blooming night jasmine. It was a chaotic, wildly overgrown sanctuary, hidden directly behind the pristine, clinical architectural lines of the main house. Above our heads, the arched glass ceiling took the full, brutal force of the coastal rain. The relentless, heavy drumming of the water against the cold panes created a deafening, isolated cocoon, shutting out the rest of the world and leaving us entirely alone in the damp warmth. Julian finally let go of my hand, and the sudden loss of his physical heat sent a sharp, involuntary shiver down my spine. He walked a few paces away, stopping beneath a massive, twisting canopy of dark green ivy. He stood with his back to me for a long moment, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy, ragged breath that betrayed the immense strain he was under. When he finally turned back to face me, he reached into the inner pocket of his dark suit jacket. My breath hitched in my throat as he withdrew a thick, folded piece of cream-colored parchment. I recognized the heavy weight of that paper instantly. It was the pre-negotiated contract document we had signed in the sterile, echoing chamber of the county courthouse. It was the physical manifestation of my gilded cage, the exact, clinical parameters of our transaction. A sudden spike of fear pierced my chest. I watched the tense, rigid line of his jaw, terrified that my public display of defiance in the drawing room had violated a hidden clause, that he was about to reinstate the insurmountable boundaries between us to protect his own vulnerability. Julian looked down at the parchment in his hands, his dark eyes entirely unreadable. "I swore an oath to your father to keep the wolves away from your door, Cora," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that somehow managed to cut through the deafening sound of the rain. "I promised Arthur I would absorb the massive debts that were drowning you, and that I would provide a fortress where no one could ever leverage your safety again. I thought the only way to honor that promise, the only way to truly protect you from the toxic reality of my family, was to keep you at an absolute distance. I thought my silence was a shield." He took a slow step toward me, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a raw, agonizing vulnerability I had never seen in him. His chest rose with a heavy, uncharacteristic breath, but I was wrong. The promise wasn't a shield, it was a cage. I watched you sit by the frozen window for months, quietly stitching a torn veil, repairing a symbol of a wedding you thought you were denied. I wanted to give you the world, but I was bound by a piece of paper that told you I only owned your debt. You stood in that drawing room today and defended a man who has given you nothing but cold isolation. You risked everything to protect me." Julian looked down at the contract, his chest heaving. "I don't want a placeholder," he whispered, the raw honesty in his tone vibrating through the humid air. "And Arthur's ghost no longer dictates my future. I am done keeping you locked inside this transaction." Slowly, deliberately, Julian gripped the thick edges of the cream-colored parchment, his large, calloused hands, the exact same hands that flawlessly commanded a billion-dollar corporate empire, The hands that had so gently bathed my feverish forehead in the dark were trembling uncontrollably. With a sudden definitive motion, he ripped the pre-negotiated contract document perfectly in half. The sharp sound of the thick paper tearing was infinitely louder than the rain beating against the glass. He tore it again, and then again, the rigid clauses, the sterile stipulations, and the cold financial boundaries fracturing into meaningless, jagged pieces. He opened his hands and let the shredded parchment fall to the damp earth at his feet, abandoning his armor entirely. He had not just destroyed an agreement. He had completely leveled the playing field. He had stripped himself of every legal advantage, standing before me not as an untouchable billionaire who had purchased a desperate liability, but as an equal, offering me a genuine choice. He closed the remaining distance between us in 2 long strides. He didn't grab me. He didn't pull me aggressively into his chest. He simply raised his hands, letting his wide, warm palms hover a fraction of an inch from my cheeks, asking for a silent permission he completely refused to demand. The heat radiating from his skin was overwhelming, mixing with the heavy scent of cedarwood and blooming jasmine. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse, the words brushing softly against my lips. It was a heavy, terrifying request, laden with the absolute surrender of his pride. I didn't step back, not because I wasn't afraid of the overwhelming intensity of the moment, but because the man standing in front of me I'd already proven that my heart was safe in his hands. I reached up, weaving my trembling fingers into the soft, dark hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down to me. The kiss was not a sudden, violent collision of pent-up dramatic tension. It was a slow, devastating thaw. It was the taste of rain, cedarwood, and profound, hard-won relief. Julian let out a quiet, shuddering breath, wrapping his powerful arms completely around my waist. He lifted me slightly off the damp stone floor, burying his face in the curve of my neck, holding me as if I were the only real thing in a world made entirely of ghosts. But the toxic roots of the Vance legacy ran deeper than a single boardroom victory. We had tuned some of quiet, fragile peace, learning the soft, unspoken rhythms of each other's lives, before the brutal reality of the outside world tore through our stone walls. It happened in our 6th month of marriage. Richard Vance, wounded but not destroyed, discovered a deeply buried, archaic clause in the primary family trust. He arrived at the estate unannounced, the heavy thud of his cane echoing like a death knell across the marble foyer. He delivered a brutal trust ultimatum, designed to shatter us entirely. Unless we subjected ourselves to a humiliating, highly publicized invasion of privacy to legally prove our marriage was genuine and consummated, the board would ruthlessly liquidate my independent lace studio, my sanctuary in Boston. The only piece of my past I had managed to salvage was held hostage. Julian was entirely prepared to go to war. I saw the terrifying, icy resolve harden in his dark eyes, the protective winter stone crashing back down over his features. He was ready to tear his own family empire down to the studs to protect my tiny, drafty workroom, but I refused to let him. I refused to let his monumental sacrifice for my father end in the destruction of his own life's work, and I flatly refused to remain a transactional piece of collateral in Richard's clinical games. So, I made the only choice that preserved both our dignities. I left. I packed my few belongings in the dead of night, slipping out of Vance Manor while a chilling rain beat against the glass. I took nothing that belonged to the trust, abandoning the sterile luxury that had never truly been mine. I caught the first train back to the East Coast, the rhythmic clack of the wheels, mirroring the hollow, agonizing ache in my chest. My Boston attic was exactly as I had left it, steeped in the faint, familiar scent of lavender and old dust, but without the heavy, grounding presence of Julian. Without the scent of cedarwood drifting down the halls, the space felt overwhelmingly cold. I threw myself into my work, burying my grief beneath piles of antique silk and delicate, torn threads, trying to convince myself that I had done the right thing. But my hands trembled with every stitch. 2 agonizing weeks passed. The coastal spring had not yet reached the city, leaving the streets slick with a freezing, relentless rain. I was sitting at my worn wooden work desk. Late one evening, my fingers numb against a spool of thread, when a heavy knock rattled the frosted glass of the studio door. My breath caught in my throat. I stood slowly, my chair scraping loudly against the uneven floorboards. When I opened the door, the bitter wind whipped through the threshold, but I didn't feel the cold. Julian stood in the freezing rain, his broad shoulders drenched, his dark coat heavy with water. The untouchable billionaire, who had lived his entire life behind impenetrable fortress walls, was standing on a cracked sidewalk in Boston, completely unsheltered. He looked utterly exhausted, his dark eyes hollowed by sleeplessness, but there was a fierce, unwavering clarity in his gaze that rooted me to the spot. "What have you done?" I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible over the harsh drumming of the rain. He didn't step into the warmth of the studio. He stayed out in the storm, letting the freezing water run down his rigid jaw. "I surrendered it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated straight through my bones. "The family trust, the board seat, the corporate empire. I signed it all over to Richard in exchange for the deed to the manor and our absolute freedom." I stared at him in horrified disbelief. The breath punched completely out of my lungs. "Julian, no, you can't just give up your entire legacy." "My legacy was a cage," he interrupted softly, his voice carrying no regret, only a profound, devastating relief. "It was a mausoleum of cold ledgers and dying promises. I don't want it, Cora. I never did. I only wanted the life it cost me to keep it." Before I could fully process the monumental weight of his sacrifice, Julian reached into the inner pocket of his soaked coat. He didn't pull out a new contract. He didn't offer a folder of financial protections. He withdrew a small, carefully wrapped linen bundle. He unwrapped it with agonizingly slow, gentle movements, protecting the fragile contents from the relentless downpour. It was the mended lace veil. He had gone into my abandoned room at Vance Manor and retrieved the delicate, historical artifact I had spent months painstakingly repairing, the fragile symbol of enduring devotion I had left behind. Slowly, deliberately, right there on the rain-slicked concrete, Julian sank to one knee. The freezing puddle soaked instantly through his expensive trousers, but he didn't flinch. He looked up at me, holding the flawless lace in his large, calloused hands, offering me his complete and total vulnerability. "I have no empire left to offer you," he whispered, the raw emotion in his tone entirely shattering the last remnants of his stoic armor. "I have no trust fund, no fortress to keep you safe from the world. I only have this. I only have me. Come home, Cora, please." A sob tore from my throat. The immense, terrifying barrier of pride and duty that had kept us apart was completely gone, washed away by the freezing rain and his absolute surrender. I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees right there on the wet pavement, ignoring the bitter cold, and threw my arms around his neck. Julian let out a ragged, shattering breath, burying his face in my shoulder, as his powerful arms crushed me to his chest. We knelt together in the storm, clinging to each other in the dark, finally free of every ghost that had haunted our past. Sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits. It waited patiently for us to break down our own walls, taking deep, quiet root in the shared spaces we were now free to claim. By the time the first pale, golden signs of coastal spring began to thaw the frost on the towering windows, the sterile, divided isolation of the east and west wings had been entirely abandoned. We returned to Vance Manor, but the vast, imposing estate had slowly contracted into something that actually felt like a home. We didn't need 30 immaculate, empty rooms to prove our worth. We only needed the library. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, when we finally formalized the reality we had built together from the splinters. There was no clinical magistrate looking at a watch. There were no calculating corporate lawyers, no flashing press cameras, and no grand echoing courthouse filled with strangers. There was only the heavy, comforting scent of old paper, the crackling warmth of a massive stone hearth, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I stood by the roaring fire, wearing a simple, long-sleeved ivory dress that brushed softly against the thick Persian rug. It wasn't a designer gown purchased to flaunt the Vance wealth. It was the quiet, dignified armor of my own choosing. But it was not the dress that carried the weight of the evening. Pinned carefully into my hair, cascading down my shoulders in intricate, flawless, floral patterns, was the mended lace veil. I had spent countless freezing hours in my drafty Boston attic, repairing this fragile artifact, tracing the broken threads of another family's history while my own life was collapsing into ruin. I had left it behind on my work desk on the day of our first wedding, convinced I had no right to wear a symbol of enduring devotion. Now, the antique Belgian silk caught the warm amber light of the fire, serving as a physical testament to the beauty of surviving devastation. Every invisible stitch I had sewn was a quiet victory, proving that broken things could indeed be held together with enough patience and care. A floorboard creaked softly near the entrance of the library. I turned my head slightly and saw Martha Gable standing in the open doorway. The formidable, iron-willed housekeeper was not carrying a silver tray, nor was she delivering a rigid daily schedule. She simply stood in the shadows, her hands clasped tightly in front of her pristine, starched apron. For the first time since I had crossed the terrifying threshold of this estate, her severe, unyielding expression completely broke. A single, quiet tear slipped down her weathered cheek, catching the firelight. She did not wipe it away. She simply gave me a small, profound nod of absolute respect, silently witnessing the joyful rebirth of the house she had fiercely guarded for decades. Julian stood facing me, fully illuminated by the glow of the hearth. The dark, impenetrable armor of winter stone he used to wear was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering peace. He wore a simple, tailored dark suit, but the harsh, unforgiving lines of his face had softened into something remarkably tender. He didn't hold a leather folio of addendums. He simply reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, velvet box. When he opened it, there was no massive, ostentatious diamond designed to intimidate a boardroom or project status to the world. Resting on the silk cushion was a simple, unadorned gold band. It was heavy, warm, and entirely authentic. He took my left hand, his calloused thumb gently brushing across my knuckles, sending a familiar spark of warmth up my arm. "No contracts," Julian whispered, his voice vibrating with a quiet, absolute certainty that anchored me to the floor. "No ledgers. No dying promises forced in the dark. Just you and me and the life we choose to write on our own terms." He slid the gold band onto my finger. It fit perfectly, a warm, grounding weight that felt exactly like a ship finally dropping anchor in a safe, quiet harbor. Then, Julian reached into his inner pocket one last time. He pulled out Arthur's silver pocket watch. The heavy, antique heirloom that had bound us together in that sterile hospital room, the object that had sealed a desperate transaction, ticked loudly in his broad palm. Julian didn't put it back in his pocket to carry the burden any longer. He turned and walked over to the massive stone mantelpiece above the roaring fire. With a slow, definitive motion, he placed the silver pocket watch directly in the center of the mantel, leaving it to rest peacefully among the framed photographs and the worn, leather-bound books. He was putting my father's ghost and the crushing generational weight of the past to rest forever. The terrifying debt was officially, finally paid. I walked up behind him, wrapping my arms gently around his waist, resting my cheek against the solid, immovable warmth of his back. He immediately covered my hands with his own, interlacing our fingers as we stood together in the quiet sanctuary of the library. Outside, the Pacific Northwest wind howled against the thick stone walls, threatening the glass, but the bitter cold could no longer reach us. People ask sometimes, if they ever dare to look past the imposing iron gates of the estate, what exactly changed between us. I don't know if I have a good, logical answer for the world outside. Maybe nothing changed. Maybe everything changed all at once. All I know is this: the incredibly powerful man who once offered me a cold, transactional contract now uses the silver tea kettle to pour me a warm cup of chamomile tea every single morning. And that, I think, is the real vow. I don't need a grand public ceremony to validate my worth. I don't need the approval of a ruthless corporate board or the cold safety of a billion-dollar trust fund. I just need him here, every day, sitting beside me in the quiet light of the dawn, even in total silence. That's what I call forever. We left the sterile illusions of luxury behind, choosing instead to build our own refuge in the quiet, breathing corners of the house. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. And as the last embers of the fire wrapped us in a soft, glowing gold, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I had finally, truly come home. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.